bounce back. It's actually being able to bounce back better. simply being able to bounce back. It's actually being able to bounce back better.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to another installment of EMDRCM Live. This is an outreach of the Executive Master in Disaster Risk and Crisis Management from the country's premier graduate school for business and management, the Asian Institute of Management. My name is Wally Panganiban, and this is our 20th episode. Can you believe it? We started right smack at the beginning of the pandemic, and here we are, almost at the end of the year, with our 20th episode. And they were uh, forcing me to say this, but the EMDRCM Live is one of the first programs at the AIM to really embrace the online platform to reach out and communicate to the public the things that we do inside the classrooms and the case rooms. Tonight, we have a very special guest. It's a returning guest, and we will be talking about a very relevant topic that I think is going to be the first time that most of you will be hearing from it. Shout out to the marketing team, Miss Carmel, Miss She, Miss Joselle, Miss Faith, who made all of this possible. Thank you for the support. So, without further ado, let's introduce our guest. He's actually a returning guest to EMDRCM Live. He is one of the youngest members of the cohort one and one of the brilliant minds inside the class. So I'll let him introduce himself further. So please, friends, welcome Mr. Joshua Carpio.
Thank you, Sir Wally. That's a very humbling introduction.
Truthful introduction. Good
Yeah,
evening. How are you, sir?
I'm good. Kind of mixed emotions, excited but at the same time nervous.
Excited about the graduation?
Yes.
Okay, that's good. And I'm guessing that, like me, you've let out a sigh of relief. Most of our academic requirements are behind us.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, so Joshua, let us tell the people who you are, what you do, what you are, where you are connected to right now.
Okay. So basically, I'm a forester by profession. So I specialize in social forestry and currently working as a sustainability consultant to one of the oldest and largest conglomerate in the country.
Let's not name that
And
conglomerate.
currently also,
Okay, let's just say that this conglomerate is something that everybody in the Philippines are familiar with.
yes,
Okay, so forestry graduate, and now you're doing consultancy work for this big
sustainability.
conglomerate on sustainability, and right now you're completing your program at the AIM.
Correct.
Okay, where are you at right now, live streaming from?
I'm currently here in Batangas, in Santo Tomas. Yeah, so around 60 kilometers away from Manila.
Right. How has the impact of the typhoon there been?
Well, in our neighborhood, there's a lot of disruptions, especially with regard to power, internet, especially with the work from home setup. Uh, so it's really create a disruption on the daily lives, but also at the same time, it create some damages on some properties here around. But thankfully, on our end, we're good, we're safe, and we were able to prepare. You know,
That's good to hear. And we hope that everybody watching this live stream, you're also safe at home with your family. And in spite of the continuous typhoons that we have experienced the past couple of weeks and will continue to experience in the coming days, that you are also prepared and getting ready to experience La Nina all over again. I think, Jocelyn, that's the perfect introduction to start talking about our topic for this evening. building the case for resilience reporting, an innovation from the EMDRCM program. So just to go back to that point, the Philippines in 2018, we were top three in the World Risk Index. And last year, we made some improvements and we fell 6 notches down. We are currently top six. But still a lot of improvement that needs to happen for the Philippines to really get out of that list. I think in the top, at least in the top 10 list. Okay, so that said, we are constantly visited by typhoons. We have about 20 a year, some of which are very devastating. We are just coming from Shawnee, about to leave the Philippine area of responsibility, and another one is on its way. Tonyo, I believe. And then just before Shawnee, we had this massive typhoon Rolly that really devastated parts of the Bicol region. So I guess that reality by now should have sinked in to a lot of the people in the Philippines that there's no escaping these natural hazards that constantly visit us.
Yes, and as you can see over the years, it's getting more frequent, but also more intense.
Right.
And that's kind of paint what kind of future we're kind of facing.
And so, what is this thing about resilience reporting that makes it relevant at this point, at this juncture?
Yeah. So the idea of resilience reporting, it starts from a simple problem. So that an organization, if an organization would like to share or disclose information about how they are resilient to all these natural and all these disasters, there's no currently a guidance or reference or standards that would help them as a tool to do that. But at the same time, noting on what you said, we starting also to realize how transparency on being disaster resilient, which I believe would be beneficial to our different stakeholders, government, local government, uh, NGOs, and but at the same time to our private organizations out there.
Right. So, just to for the benefit of those who are relatively new to the discussion about resilience, when we talk about resilience, what are we actually referring to?
Well, if we would define it, we could say that it's the ability of an individual organization to withstand, adapt, or transform for the better uh, after disruptions or shocks.
So
And
these shocks include.
this includes man-made disasters like industrial accidents, but at the same time from natural hazards like from typhoon, uh,
And
and
COVID-19, we can consider this as a major shock.
that's correct.
Right, right. So when you talk about this resilience thing amongst institutions, across institutions, we're looking at their ability to bounce back better.
That's correct.
Right. Okay. So where does transparency and reporting come in the picture? And why should they do it?
Well, actually, this is where we start to build the case that currently, since it's not yet being standardized, existent, this is where I think where the opportunity is. Currently, we know that if you wanted to know the health, the financial health of the company, there's financial reporting. And for those who are now in the advanced field of sustainability, the non-financial data, we have a lot of standards and frameworks to disclose about that. But when we talk about the ability to bounce back better, this is where currently the missing link is, because we don't have clear guidance or path that which would aggregate different information and guide an organization how to disclose it. And I think, Wally, there are two important things that we need to consider on this idea. One, what type or kind of information that really reflects the ability of an organization to bounce back. So that's the information side. That's what we want to know. The second side is on the information giver, meaning, does the organizations know what to measure? Does the organization is willing to disclose it? And does the organization know how to properly communicate it? So I think those two things are things that we need to balance as we move forward.
Okay, so let's highlight those two information. First, what the external groups would like to know. So when we talk about external groups, this include the government, perhaps,
Government, yes, local government, NGOs, community groups.
perhaps even financial institutions.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. And then on the other hand, you have the information from the source, from the company itself. And you mentioned what information they are willing to share and what information, or actually how to share this information in terms of packaging the data that comes from them. And you reference also what is it that they need to share. I guess even in that particular divide, the information that is warranted and the information willing that companies are willing to disclose, there's a big disconnect. In the current setup, are you seeing the same push and pull?
Well, currently, what I see right now is that there's no current push and pull yet, specifically because the groundwork on this, I believe, has not yet really begun. And I think this is where the opportunity comes in.
Right. So what you're saying is currently governments, financial institutions are not yet requesting information on disaster resilience from companies. But do you think there will come a time when these institutions will ask for this information?
Yes, I think it will. And as far from other literature says, there are actually other financial institutions requesting for business continuity plan of an organization. So I think there's kind of some mechanisms, case studies that we need to connect, but the actual push and pull where we could see movement and development are not yet in place. And I think
Right.
uh, one good thing about this program is that is what we are being trained for, being honed for. One
You're
of our
referring to the
courses,
EMDRCM program.
yes, the EMDRCM program. And I would like to highlight is the management toolkits, but at the same time, the bridging leadership being taught to us that starts how do we bring these stakeholders together? How do we influence behavioral change? And one thing that struck really me about our program, this is not a work of a technical work, but really a leadership work.
Right. And I would just like to highlight one interesting point about the pull that I think is going to happen very soon. When we started talking about resilience reporting, we based our discussions on the reality that the Philippines is subject to a host of natural and man-made hazards. And whether you are a company that provides loans or you provides incentives, just like I don't know, rewards for compliance or whatnot, I think in the future people would start to require organizations to divulge information that would showcase their ability to withstand from disasters, so like typhoons. If
Yes,
right.
that's a good point, Wiley. And if we would look at this point right now and try to preserve the future, we would always know that there would be future pandemics, multiple disasters. And and we want as stakeholders of different organizations, we must now this resilience reporting gives us a tool where we make an organization more proactive and accountable by encouraging them, incentivizing them to disclose how they would be able to bounce back when these kinds of you know scenarios happen. And that would also change how we manage organizations and would affect how we do our operations, because transparency would now drive action.
Right. So to try to understand that deeper, Jostren, you're saying that, uh, for example, a financial institution is going to it has a pool of resources to provide as loan or additional capital to a particular organization. The idea that this financial institution will require that organization intending to make the loan submit materials that would showcase their efforts to bounce back better from a disaster is something that can drive the necessary change in our organizations in the way that they actually program their operations. I think it follows in the same uh, uh, line of thought as the sustainability financing. Would you agree?
Yes, that's correct, Wally. Like on the sustainability, it talks more on the ESG risks and how do they address it. And
So just to understand better the ESG aspect, can you explain a little about ESG for the benefit of those who are not quite familiar with it?
so ESG is our measurement of the sustainability of the company. So that's the environmental, the social, and the governance side. And so when we would like to assess or measure how they are doing in terms of their sustainability, we measure those three aspects. And currently, there's also a growing movement towards reporting those kinds of information. And we see, and we're clearly seeing right now, that as stakeholders today really favor those that perform well on managing those ESG.
Right. So I also read a little while ago that there are a lot of more shareholders are really into looking at that performance of the company, not simply on the profitability and the financial aspects of the company, but more on how the company's operations impact the environment, the social and the governance aspects.
That's correct, Wally. And in relation to our program, we also discussed that in our sustainable finance course. And we believe this discussion of resilience reporting actually came out of our discussions in our class with Professor Calderon. And one thing that we could see on that reporting side, so we now have a history of how organizations, specifically private companies, disclose information. So we have the financial. Now we're moving on the non-financial, and then on the climate change impact. And I think what we could see on those evolution is not really as a pattern, but some processes and some mechanisms, how transparency can incentivize each stakeholders. And with regard to disaster resilience, I think this is would be much more beneficial to each stakeholder. So let me give you an example. So for example, you're a local government, an island. So where you're exposed to different uh, natural hazards. You have typhoon. There's also a possible tsunami. There's earthquake. And as a local government, or also as an employee or a supplier or an NGO, we would now start to discuss if this organization really prepared to bounce back, adapt, and transform for the better if all this case happens. And I think that's where the discussion really should focus. Uh, and when we try to look at that, we're now shifting our mindset to a more proactive, a more action oriented, and more on resilient thinking.
Right. And I think when you try to really contemplate the foundations of what you are proposing, resilience reporting, it all goes down to how do you ensure, how do you manifest, how do you prove that whatever resources will be shared with you, you can sustain or manage in spite of the risks that's present in your community. So, for example, your case about this island municipality or city that's prone to all of these natural hazards, if there is a company that's operating in that island and they're asking for financial support from my organization, then I would not necessarily ask them for evidences that show that they can manage their operations in spite of the risks, right?
Yes, that's correct. And
And
if we would also kind of try to reflect with this COVID situation pandemic, 100 years ago, this situation already happened. And if we can move of 2 years before COVID and we try to reflect, knowing a pandemic scenario, we know some of the current thinking is really on silos, that I'll just focus on my organization. I'll just
Right.
talk on my suppliers, but I'll not, connect with the local government, other industry groups. And if resilience reporting was on that place where 2 years ago we would start requesting organizations to disclose if a COVID-19 happens, or even or government organizations, how are we going to transform better for that? And if that is already a norm, then we see how resilient the community would be, because it would drive a collaborative action. So for instance, one organization would be procuring on one supplier, and they have to work together. But at the same time, this supplier would also realize that he's supplying two or three companies, and he need to settle how he or she would be able to work together in all those services.
Right. And I think that that falls right smack into what you were saying about bridging leadership. At the end of the day, disaster resilience is everybody's business, and we have a role to play. If we are able to somehow drive different stakeholders to work together to build up their resilience, then that's fantastic. I think we move closer to really building sustainable resilience in the Philippines, in our communities. So just to go back to the other part of that equation, so we talked about heavily on the push from the information uh, beneficiaries, no, the ones who are asking for resilience
Yes.
disclosures.
And I think
Let's now, yeah,
one last note I forgot to share. Uh, so we have these different stakeholders, and the thing that we need to do is to understand, with these stakeholders of your organization, let's say in general, what are the information that are common to them? What are the information being requested that is not common to them? And this is also where, uh, the scholarly work would come into enter, because we need those uh, think tanks to guide us which information is a must, is a good to know, or perhaps something that we could work on in the future.
okay, right, absolutely. And that's bringing me to that point I was about to raise. So we talked about that side of the aisle where people want to get this information so that they can also have a better reference point in making decisions, probably investment decisions. Now, on the one hand, you have the organizations themselves sharing this information. So let's start with what particular information do you think are critical for informations to disclose? Oh, wait, before even going there, what are information that companies need to know, even if there's no disclosure yet? What are resilience information that companies need to be mindful of on their own, even before they disclose it?
Yeah. So I think with regard to that, what I'm seeing right now is I think there could be two or three types of information. One, we could start to look on metrics like quantitative, let's say percentage exposure, that could be. Second is more of qualitative information. This is where we try to look on strategies,
Right.
operations, policies, programs, uh, how their execution, day to day works out. So I think there are different types of information that organization should take a look.
Right. So if I'm going to understand what you just shared, one component would be understanding their risks, right?
Correct.
Right, because for those of you who are not familiar with the EMDRCM program, part of what we have been trying to really understand is the management of disaster risk, actually disaster risk reduction. And it's quite unfortunate that a lot of organizations are clueless when it comes to their own particular risks. And also, that said, it becomes critical information for prospective investors or creditors to identify what are the risks that are involved in the operations of this organization. So you mentioned something about their levels of exposure to a particular risk. So if I'm going to try to understand that, if a company approaches me and wants to partner with me, before I really embrace that partnership, I'd like to understand, wait, is this particular organization exposed to volcanic eruptions? Is there flooding in
Yes.
their areas? What's the
And
risk of a tsunami? Yeah,
what we see, these kinds of risks are, they're not in silos. They come together. Like they're still man-made, cyber risk, and at the same time, they're exposed to this
exactly.
natural risk.
And then going to your other point about the other stuff that comes with identifying the risk, you mentioned their policies, their strategies, their programs, key aspects of their operations that are intended to address this particular risk. So it at least when you said that, it becomes more clear to me that these are information that are not voluntarily shared at this point, right?
That's correct. Usually, these kinds of information are uh, confidential, let's say.
Right.
Uh, but I think this is where the work of leadership would come in, where we gather different leaders and start discussing what level of transparency that would be beneficial to each one of us. And
Right.
I think to also shift the color of to the information provider or organizations, I think there are organizations today that has been really positioning themselves on the disaster resilient side. It's good, it's great. But this is also shows a new opportunity for the new normal because we do not these kinds of this same mistake would happen again. And this resilience reporting provides a tool for those progressive leaders companies uh, to start working and thinking about also these things, and also which could establish their brand and reputation. And this is a very big deal right now, as I can say, because if we say that the Al volcano would erupt at any time, are we sure as the stakeholders of where we live right now, to our other companies, have they really have a bouncing back better in
Strategy.
place,
Yeah.
not in silos, but in collaboration with other
Right,
stakeholders?
right. Absolutely. I'm going back to your point earlier about some of the information, which explains the pull from information providers to keep on to their information. So you mentioned something about the risks not being well disclosed. At the same time, some of the strategies. I could understand the strategies that they would try to keep to themselves for proprietary reasons, but admittedly, there are organizations that downplay the risks, right? That's present in their areas or locations. And it could be also like what you said. They might not really be familiar with the risks that's present in their communities. The experience with the Taal eruption in January somehow showed us that a lot of the locators, the business locators in the Calabarzon area, were not really prepared for what happened, which is the ashfall that really forced the entire Calabarzon and Metro Manila to grind down to a halt. So going back to that discussion about resilience reporting, understanding that you are part or disclosing that you have that risk might be risky for some because it might make people shy away from going to that area or partnering with you. But on the other hand, to your point about improving your brand and reputation, disclosing information that showcases your ability, right, to bounce back from this disaster somehow mitigates that risks and shows to potential partners or investors that, oh, this organization has really thought of the disaster resilience components in their planning. That's why I would want to partner with this. And I'm not sure if I am as optimistic as you in saying that many organizations are getting into the DR space. I think I think there's still a lot of organizations that are slowly appreciating disaster resilience, but have ways to go to that extent. So I will have to go double check and see from my sources. Okay,
Yeah.
so continuing the discussion, Sir Joshren, you talked about the information that's critical for information providers to disclose. What could be incentives for them to do so?
That's a good question, Wally. And I think that's also one thing that we need to establish on working these kinds of mechanism. Because number one that we need to address is the level of expectation on both ends. Those who are information, I mean, requester, or those who wanted to know, and those who wanted to provide. And we need to match those kinds of expectation. And I think
Before we
incentives,
continue, Joshren, let's try to understand that. Where is the disconnect? Why is there a disconnect between those who would like to know and those who need to share the information?
because I think there's a disconnect because first we need to see on those stakeholders together so that each one stakeholder would understand the other. So there must be empathy on both sides so that it would not be mechanical. So for instance, one stakeholder might be asking about how their ability to bounce back on their uh, energy business portfolio. And this energy business is at loss. What kind of information do you need? How am I going to share it with you? Who should, who's the perfect audience for it? And this is where resilience reporting would come in, where we start to establish on a multi-stakeholder engagement and saying, this is what stakeholders must know, this is how you should disclose it, and this is where you should disclose it. And these are the minimum that you could share to your stakeholders.
Right.
And
Oh,
and
good. Yeah.
and addressing those intricacies uh, would enable to address each other's interests, and that's what we would like to create a value creation. But on the one side, let's focus on empathy. This is one thing that the program teaches us, is that when we enter on their shoes, we also would like to know where are they on these kinds of discussion. What would be their hardships on doing that, and what would be their strengths that we could leverage. Because at the end of the day, we want on the social marketing standpoint, we want to make sure that things would be on an easy to do principle, and so that we could drive these kinds of actions that we want. Because there's a danger of simply just doing it, sharing information, but we must not lose on the spirit of resilience reporting.
Right.
It's on getting the value creation, on disclosing, on being transparent on disaster resilience.
Okay.
And one example would be, there is what we call as impact investors, where they include in their investment decisions the social or environmental impact that aligned on their values. But I think there is now movement where we start to ensure that these are resilience informed, that their ability to bounce back are now integrated on how investors are making their decisions.
Okay. Uh, Guys, this is the first time I'm hearing this resilience informed, and I'm going to attribute that to Sir Joshren moving forward. Right? Most of the time we talk about risk-informed decisions. Now it's more than risk-informed. You're talking about resilience-informed, capturing the essence of what you're trying to say. So just to try to understand better, when you say some people, the disconnect between the information receiver and the information provider, I think it goes back to our discussion even before this live stream about some of the things that a regulator might want you to disclose, and from the perspective of the company disclosing, by doing so would put me in a position of showing weaknesses or non-compliance. I think that's probably one of the pain points as well that you are mentioning.
Yes, and I think that's one way on the regulatory side. And I think one example would really be on our listed companies, because as public has interest on it, the regulator has the responsibility to ensure uh, to make the interaction more beneficiary to each stakeholder. So it's part of their fiduciary, let's say, fiduciary duty. And usually these kinds of transparency starts by those organizations that are really proactive and progressive, those that understand the importance of disaster resilience, but at the same time bold enough uh, to take the first step.
Right. And I think the discussion on the diffusion of innovations model from the marketing class also highlights that those that are the first 25% of the population that somehow appreciates disaster resilience and has the resources, the early adapters, can really jump into it. And there would be a bigger chunk of the population that will be struggling to follow suit. I would just like to go back to what you said about when we were talking about the disconnect between the information provider and information giver, because I can demand all I want, the information that I think I need to get from you. At the same time, as the organization, well, I can just choose which one that I will disclose. But there is a third, maybe even a fourth or a fifth actor in this spectrum of, let's say, the community or the ecosystem. And I think this is what I'm hearing from you. It's not as simple as, for example, an independent siloed. This is the word that you use. It's not a siloed discussion between company A and company B. The government has to be involved because at the end of the day, everything that happens in the community is a part of what they need to monitor and keep track of. I think the same argument can be said about the ESG and sustainability financing, because while the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas issued their circular recently mandating banks to really drive sustainable financing without a clear guideline on what actually standards do we need to push or follow, it doesn't become really concrete. There doesn't seem to be a concrete path towards making any concrete change in the communities. So that's my opinion. Um, so what you were
Sir,
saying, yeah.
I would like to build up on that. And getting on the ESG side, what we see for the past 10 years is that it's really market driven. So when investors and other capital providers started to realize that, considering companies performing well on this ESG gives us a more consistent return, and that gives an incentive. But on the other hand, companies that take leadership on that are now starting to reap the benefits. So
Right.
now there's both interest and benefits that we can see being materialized, and that's very market driven. And that's also one way on our treaty of change on how resilience reporting could take off, specifically for our country. But at the same time, we have to understand who are the major capital providers for
Mhm.
our, companies, because at the end of the day, they are the one that are setting tone on the direction of these organizations.
Right. I just like to pick up on what you said, because this was actually part of my paper to Professor, I think, Calderon as well. If the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas really starts really implementing their sustainability financing requirements, and then companies who need to transact with banks and financial institutions start doing sustainability financing practices, so they start to impact environment, social, and government development projects. What if all of the companies just ended up doing tree planting? What if 90% of all of those who are subscribing to sustainability financing only focuses on one aspect, right? So that was one of my questions to one of the papers that I submitted, is maybe there's a need for what you said, following exactly what you said, a third party in the mix between the groups asking for disclosures, the group providing the disclosure, to come in and say, okay, so while we're looking at it from your company's perspective, from your business perspective, this is the other stakeholders' perspective, from the government, from the community. And I think that's the beauty of what you were explaining earlier, Josren.
Yes,
So it doesn't really become a siloed approach.
correct. And what I'm hearing from you, Wally, is actually two things, and this is also what we learned from our policy class, no? Uh, there would always be externalities, and we know public policy is one way to address negative externals, especially if the market forces are not working well. Uh, Second point, I think the reason why also regulators are starting this year are pushing on these kinds of policy is I think on the spirit that they don't want these our fellow organizations miss out.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's what we could also see. That's somehow primarily market driven again. And but on resilience reporting, that is something that we need to explore. What would be the best model for that?
Right.
Uh, but at the same time, like what you said, we should also be mindful of the externality on these kinds of innovation would bring, since we're now talking to uh, number of stakeholders. But I think noting those possible negative externalities, I think it should be part of the discussion that how we would develop and roll this out.
Right. And I'm not quite familiar how the ESG was initiated in the country. Um, do you feel that there is a lot of buy-in already about the ESG? Because maybe that's something that we can also look into when we continue the discussions about resilience reporting.
That's a good point, Wiley. At this point, the SEC now has a mandatory sustainability reporting, and I believe the spirit of that is that again we do not want our fellow institutions miss out to the opportunities as the world transition to a low carbon economy.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but I think one factor that we should also uh, take a look is even though these organizations are taking part, there are different levels of participation. So as we know, those at the forefront have really well experienced in terms of disclosing information. And
Like the
going,
conglomerate that you work for
yes,
because of you.
no, no.
Okay.
So there's organizations that are in different stages, but those being involved on sustainability reporting has now an emphatic feeling of how is it being done, what are the needed. So they know internally the pains and gains of it, and that could be a leverage on how we're going to push with resilience reporting. It's not that we're creating another wheel, but rather the spirit of resilience reporting is somehow we should mold it properly so that as these organizations move forward on their non-financial reporting, they could also take on these kinds of novel initiatives. And that is something that you really push forward is on the idea of empathy, the design thinking
Mhm.
that we should take a look.
Right. So going deeper into the discussion about empathy, what would you think are the main constraints for, let's call them the smaller players, no MSMEs? What would be a challenge for them to get into resilience reporting?
Well, I think the very fundamental question that organization would ask is, what's in it for me? And when we establish the business case for that, and as you know, economics, there's always a limited resources, and what's the best way? And if we could position so that so as you can see, this is no longer focused on one organization, but we started to work on the stakeholders around that organization so that we could create a business case on that environment. And this is what we also been hearing, what we call the resilience dividend. And that's actually what
Okay, wait.
on us
I'm trying to absorb it. First, resilience informed, and now we have resilience dividend. Okay, I'm learning so much from Sir Josh Ren. Take note, this might be a play for potentially being a faculty at the EMDRCM. Okay, go ahead, sir.
so basically it's getting the idea of their return on investing on these kinds of initiatives. Because even as they report on their resilience, they would also see gaps. But that gap would give an organization a pathway where to improve on. The business case on this is to adjust the short term expectations of the organization again with its long term. As we see on climate change, uh, the natural hazards would intensify and those impacts would be felt, on 20 or 30 years from now. And we need to establish a science-based arrangement. And this is where I think an independent organization could take in. An organization that could be a safe space platform where these organizations can sit down and start discussing uh, how can we create value on this. What information should we start working with? And are this really information really reflects resilience? Because that might be different per types of organization or industry. And this is also where the scholarly work, those scholars can enter and collaborate. And as in this program, this is where we are trained both our mindset and skills is to be an integrator.
Right.
So we need an integrator at this point.
Uh, so I guess this is what I'm taking away from what you just said. More MSMEs need to understand the resilience dividend. Okay, the return of investments that they would put into making their organizations resilient. So even if you take away the idea of resilience reporting, them knowing how disaster resilience investments concretely impact them, protects them, guarantees their continuity, and protects their stakeholders, their assets moving forward, is already a win for them. But again, that said, it's not that easy trying to showcase that to, I think, MSMEs. To your point, a lot of them are struggling, especially with COVID-19, and maybe thinking about disaster resilience at this point might be miles away in their list of priorities. But you're absolutely right. Getting organizations, MSMEs to understand that even before you start disclosing things, putting in mechanisms to ensure disaster resilience of your organization is a big win. Now, quantifying that versus the investment that must be put in is, well, of course, a challenge. So when you talk to a small manufacturing company, telling them, okay, you need to beef up on your infrastructure to prevent it from collapsing from the strong winds that usually cuts across this region, the investment that he needs to put in might scare him off, but the rewards that come from it, well, while it's obvious to some, for those who will be shelling out the money, would be a bitter pill to swallow. So you're absolutely right. And I think to what you are saying, as more people, and hopefully those who are listening would understand that we talk about resilience all the time, and some people still have a vague idea of what it is. But the reality of it, if we are able to program resilience in our organization, there is a big return. And I think Jostren, when he continues to talk about resilience reporting, can really outline for everybody what exactly this return is.
Correct, Wally. And I think there are two things that I would like to build up on that. One is there's the internal realization based on their investments, what perhaps they could have saved or avoided costs. But there's the second sphere of, let's say, incentive. And that is working with the stakeholders to ensure that they get uh, other benefits. Like, for example, one big organization might prefer them to the other because they have this investments on resilience, which is being disclosed through resilience reporting mechanism. And by building that kind of community, we're building a coalition that really promotes resilience in the center of investments decision, business decisions, and even uh, collaboration.
Partnerships, right? So to try to laymanize what you said, if I am a big company, I'm looking for a supplier for, let's say, a packaging material, and there are two options before me: company A, company B. They offer the same product, raw material, to me at the same cost. So how would I make a decision when I go deeper into the evaluation of the company? Company A has a robust disaster resilience program. Company B is clueless about disaster resilience. So from what you are just explaining, it becomes a no-brainer. At all things being equal, I would go for a company that I can be sure of to deliver because of their disaster resilience mechanisms in place.
Correct. And at the same time, this small organization has also now the imperative on how to connect to other organizations because they have to collaborate because their disaster resilience would be integrated to the organizations they would be working with. And that's where transparency would be very valuable.
Right.
And once we know the minimal or the minimum information that one organization must know and so does the other, and then therefore then that's where we started to create a movement on how we're becoming proactive on creating a disaster resilient organizations, but also a disaster resilient country.
Community, correct, absolutely. And I keep on, every time I hear you discuss this, and as well as other members of the cohort, I keep on going back to, I think it was Prof Ken who first made me realize the undeniable truth that this development cannot happen if you are not resilient,
Yes, they
right?
are
So we
two sides
cannot
of the same coin.
we cannot pull them apart. You can probably get into a lot of accomplishments doing development work, but if you are not disaster resilient, all of your hard work will be washed down the river basin, and so you're back to square one. I'm going to ask this tricky question to put you on the spot. Okay, which is more critical to implement first? Sustainability reporting or resilience reporting?
Well, I think
So
at
I'm
this
talking to a
point,
sustainability person.
yeah. Well, as a sustainability professional, the first thing I would like to know is what information are you looking and where is it based? Is it science based? And actually, that is now where we build the case for resilience reporting. We start to determine that we work with scholars, uh, make a good business case of it, and then see how it would develop through time. Because this is a journey actually where we use this as a tool, the transparency as a tool where we want each member of the stakeholders develop in a reinforcing way. Because every year they would develop, but at the same time, we know that in every year there might be new uh, novel and think tanks on resilience. So at the same time, we have a clear direction where we are going.
Right. So to all of you who are watching this live stream, remember Mr. Josrin Carpio, because probably in a year's time, his name will be synonymous to resilience reporting. Okay. So I don't think I'm not seeing any questions. I'm thinking everybody's still blown away by the things that you are sharing. So Josrin, are there any developments that you would like to share about resilience reporting that you are at liberty to disclose at this time?
Well, I think the good thing with this is that it's now being on the discussion. And now that we have an idea of it, I think this is also the perfect time where we could also work together. So I and Wally have been working on this, also with our other cohort of the program. So this is not part of our final project or this came out of how we integrate our different courses and then trying to sit down and discuss. And then when we see there's a value, that's where like-minded people come together and those with like-minded vision started to keep things moving. And I think this is what the program is all about. Uh, and it's not just a brick and mortar, but rather as through time the way we think, the way we analyze is changing as term passes until we come up to the level we started to be integrators and great collaborators.
Right. Full disclosure, Jocelyn and I are part of Resilient PH, and we intend to really push forward with resilience reporting very soon and moving into 2021, way past our graduation. So I'm going to park our conversation and resilience reporting and now ask you questions about your experience as a student of the EMDRCM program, sir. Is that okay?
Yes, sige.
Okay, what brought you to the program?
Well, I think three things. One, uh, as a leader, you have a vision. And when you see the opportunity, where there's a great institution where you see alumni creating impact and in leadership positions, you're also being attracted to that kind of institutions. And that's the brand of AIM, the management and leadership.
Okay.
Second, is on the idea of being together with like-minded people. Uh, Knowing how AIM works, I know that when I enter the program, people with the same kind of mindset, like myself, uh, those crazy people who dream big, they would be my classmates. And lastly, it's gut feel. You know when it is for you. And I think for our viewers, considering a graduate studies, even in the midst of the new normal, the executive master in disaster risk and crisis management is the best that you could get to achieve the maximum level of your leadership journey. And if I would compare myself 18 months ago, today, I would really, I really cannot imagine how I think, how I analyze things, I work with others. Uh, but at the same time, how we also manage our ethics and our attitude.
Right. Full disclosure again, everybody. Josren is at the top of the class of the EMDRCM cohort one. Okay. So, what would you say? Uh, what do you think, in your experience of the 18 months of the program, was the biggest challenge for you?
That's a good question, Wally. I think one of the biggest challenge is when we when we finished all the courses. Well, actually, as we go along, and we're working on our final project, and we started to think, how do we make sense of all this training and put it into reality? And really, one of my challenge is focusing on the capstone because this is not just a scholarly work where we sit, do our research, but rather it's a leadership work and a leadership in action. And that's really, I think, the most challenging because you have to deal with different stakeholders. There's a lot of uncertainties. There are things that are not in your control. You would make mistakes. You would regret things, but at the same time, that what makes the our resilience action plan uh, perfect to cap off the program.
Okay. It's the perfect exclamation point. But again, to your point, it's not actually the end because I'm hearing from Sir Ace and Sir John that the BRRS is going to be a full-blown project moving forward.
Yeah, so that's also the beauty is that after graduation, our hard work on our final project, we would turn it into a more scaling and impactful service and mechanism.
Right,
Of
right,
course,
right.
for our community and country.
Right. So what started from the EMDRCM program moves into the community, and you have multiplied the impact of the program. Last question, Sir Jostren. what was your best memory of the past several months of the EMDRCM program?
Well, so I have two best memories. So one, the
Okay.
pre-COVID, so we have face-to-face. Uh, I love when we go crazy on case discussions. So EIM is known for its case study method, and each student would really share what he thinks, what would be his decision if he's on that character shoes, and I think that's where you get the value when you started to see how each of your classmates think, analyze, and I think one also is when we do our field work. We went
Mhm.
to Marawi, so we have the opportunity to visit the most affected area. So we went there. We see how it was devastated, and it was a around a week immersive experience, and I think that's priceless. We went there through our rapid air assessment, which is part of this program. Yeah, and then for the COVID phase of our is is on the late night discussion with my learning team. So I think in the program, it's not a one-man journey, but
Mhm.
I think unlike other institutions, you start in this program with a group of people where you would work with on different subjects. And on those COVID is those late night where we start to comfort each one, encourage each one, help one another on one difficult course, and that also shows I think an experience how you work with others.
Right, 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 right. Okay. Thank you so much, Jocelyn, for spending time and for detailing all about this resilience reporting. Just this is my announcement to all of you watching this live stream. Give us a couple of months and we will announce to you the journal entry of Sir Jocelyn on resilience reporting. So, Jocelyn, would you like to share a few words, last words about resilience reporting before we end?
Well, I think for closing words is if you been intrigued, find this interesting, uh, this is an innovation from the program. There's a lot more innovations that would come from our cohort for the next cohort, but might also be from you who would be part of the next cohort. And if you would also like to collaborate with us and get to know more or raise concerns or issues, we would love to connect with you. Just connect with our AIM admissions team and marketing team. They would gladly set up us on a Zoom meeting and see where we can work together on this.
Thank you, Sir Jocelyn Carpio. There you have it, ladies and gentlemen, the 20th episode of EMDRCM Live. This has been an outreach of the Executive Master on Disaster Risk and Crisis Management. If you want to know more about the EMDRCM and the Stephen Schwillig School of Development Management, check out Dev at Work at AIM. And you can just like what Joshua mentioned, you can continue to reach out to the marketing and recruitment team should you be inclined to become the next Joshua of future cohorts of the EMDRCM program. Thank you, everybody. Stay safe. Good evening.
It's not just simply being able to bounce back. It's actually being able to bounce back better.